The sun rose slowly over the valley, casting a pale gold hue over the sprawling estate. The distant mountains, wrapped in mist, seemed to watch over the land with silent judgment. Within the stone walls of the old manor, the sounds of harsh voices and scuffling echoed through the halls. It was here, in these cold corridors, that she lived, an Omega, a slave by birth, bound not only by chains of iron but by chains of circumstance and cruelty. Her name was Alara, though few called her that. Most knew her only as the slave girl, a title that had followed her like a shadow since childhood. Every day brought the same torment, the same sting of lashes, the same sharp words that cut deeper than any whip. Her masters, a cruel pair who found pleasure in her suffering, ensured she knew her place. Even in moments of quiet, the fear lingered, a silent specter in every corner, every glance, every breath. Yet, within her, there was a quiet flame that no whip could extinguish. A longing for freedom, for warmth, for a life where she could breathe without fear. But hope was dangerous, and Alara had learned to hide it, to tuck it away beneath layers of obedience and silence. On this particular morning, she moved through the corridors like a ghost. Her bare feet whispered against the cold stone floor as she carried a tray of water and bread to the master's dining room. She avoided their eyes, lowered her gaze, and prayed silently that today would not bring new punishment. But fate has a way of intervening when one least expects it. From the shadows of the great hall, a figure emerged. Tall, broad-shouldered, and cloaked in the kind of presence that demanded attention, he was unlike anyone she had ever seen. His hair, streaked with silver, hinted at years of loss and sorrow. His eyes, though sharp and calculating, carried a depth of understanding that seemed almost impossible in a world so cruel. He was the widowed king, a ruler whose lands stretched far and whose heart had long been closed. Rumors whispered of his late wife, of the joy he had lost, and of the unyielding solitude he had embraced since her passing. Many had tried to approach him, to claim favor, to gain his trust, but few had succeeded. And yet, when his gaze met hers, there was no condemnation, only a quiet curiosity, as if he saw through the layers of fear she had built around herself. Alara froze, the tray trembling slightly in her hands. For a moment, the world seemed to stop, the harsh voices, the crack of the whip, the bitterness of her life, all faded into silence. He did not speak, yet his presence spoke volumes. He did not judge, he merely observed, like a silent sentinel witnessing a fragile beauty he could not yet name. And in that fleeting moment, a seed of hope was planted in her heart. A dangerous, tender hope that perhaps, just perhaps, life could hold more than pain. But the masters were not blind. Their eyes narrowed, and a cruel smile twisted across one of their faces. "Who is this?" one demanded, his voice laced with suspicion. "Do you know him, girl?" Alara shook her head, but the king's gaze softened. "I am not here to harm her," he said, his voice calm, commanding yet gentle. "She is under my protection now, whether she realizes it or not." The masters recoiled, sensing power beyond their understanding. Alara, meanwhile, felt something stir within her, a strange and frightening relief. For the first time in her life, she was seen not as property, not as an object, but as a human being. And in that moment, she realized that her life was about to change forever. The first days after the king's sudden appearance in the manor were a blur for Alara. Life, which had always been marked by pain and the oppressive weight of chains, began to shift in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. She was still a slave in the eyes of those who had held her captive for so long, yet the very air seemed different. The king's presence was like a shield, an invisible barrier against cruelty that had tormented her since childhood. At first, she could not understand it. The world had always been harsh, unforgiving, and she had learned to mistrust every kind word, every glance that lingered too long. To feel safe, even slightly, was a strange sensation that made her heart both ache and flutter. She moved cautiously, glancing at the king whenever she could, trying to decipher the quiet authority in his eyes. There was no need for commands or threats. His presence alone seemed to demand loyalty, respect, and even something deeper, trust. One evening, as twilight painted the manor in shades of violet and gold, he called for her. The summons was simple, polite, yet impossible to ignore. Alara, he said, his voice low and even, carrying the weight of someone who had known loss but refused to be defeated by it. Come with me. There is something you should see. Her heart raced as she followed him through corridors that seemed suddenly unfamiliar, walls that had once felt suffocating now opening into a grand hall she had never entered. At the far end, a door stood partially ajar, light spilling through in warm, inviting streams. Inside, the room was unlike anything she had ever seen. Rich tapestries lined the walls, depicting scenes of peace and prosperity rather than cruelty. A fire burned in a stone hearth, casting flickering shadows that danced across the polished floors. Shelves of books, scrolls, and artifacts spoke of knowledge and care, not of punishment or domination. This is my sanctuary, the king said quietly, almost reverently, as he gestured for he are to step inside. A place where pain and fear do not rule. You are welcome here, Alara. Alara's breath caught in her throat. To be called by her name, spoken with such gentleness and without mockery, was a sensation she could scarcely comprehend. She stepped further inside, her eyes scanning the room, taking in the warmth and safety that seemed almost alien. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel something she had thought long dead, hope. The king watched her closely, noting the small, hesitant movements, the way her shoulders tensed and relaxed, the cautious way she allowed herself to be drawn toward the fire. He had ruled his lands with strength and precision, yet nothing had prepared him for the raw fragility of this Omega in his care. She had survived horrors he could scarcely imagine, yet there was resilience in her, a quiet strength beneath the tremor of fear. Why are you helping me? She asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking louder might shatter the fragile bubble of safety around her. The king paused, his gaze distant for a moment, haunted by memories he rarely allowed to surface. Because, he said softly, I know what it is to lose everything. To feel powerless. To live in a world that offers nothing but pain. You should not have to endure that, Alara. Not while I am able to prevent it. She wanted to argue, to say that she had always been alone, that no one could truly protect her, but something in the warmth of his words, the steady certainty in his tone, silenced her objections. Instead, she nodded, the smallest flicker of trust beginning to grow within her. Days turned into weeks, and the king's influence over her life became more profound. He did not demand obedience through fear or intimidation. Instead, he offered guidance, protection, and moments of gentle teaching, simple lessons on life, on survival, on understanding one's own worth. Each word he spoke, each act of kindness, chipped away at the walls she had built around herself. At night, she would lie in the small room he had prepared for her, the first room she had ever called her own, and stare at the ceiling. Memories of pain and suffering haunted her still, but they were slowly being replaced by something new, a feeling of belonging, of being seen, of being valued. And as much as she feared it, she could not deny the growing awareness in her chest, that she was beginning to care for the man who had brought light into her darkness. The king, too, felt the stirrings of something unexpected. His heart, long hardened by grief and solitude, found itself drawn to her in ways he had not anticipated. He did not yet allow himself to speak the words, to acknowledge the depth of feeling that had quietly taken root, but in his eyes and gestures, Alara B. Eagan to see it. A protection that was more than duty, a warmth that was more than kindness, something deeper, something that might one day become love. Yet the world outside the manor remained unforgiving. Threats still lingered beyond the walls, and the cruel masters who had once ruled over Alara did not forget so easily. The king knew that he could protect her only so long, and that vigilance would be required to ensure that the fragile safety they had found within these walls was not shattered. And so, in the quiet moments by the fire, as Alara learned to trust again and the king allowed himself to feel again, both of them began a journey neither had expected, one toward healing, toward understanding, and toward a bond that might one day become unbreakable. The first threads of a future together were being woven, delicate yet unyielding, in the sanctuary of a room filled with warmth, hope, and the promise that even the most broken hearts could find solace. The sun rose slowly over the estate, but the light could not chase away the shadows that lingered in Alara's heart. Life within the king's sanctuary had offered her a taste of peace, yet the memories of her past refused to release their grip. Each night, as she lay beneath the soft linens of her own room, the echoes of cruelty, the slaps, the shouts, the laughter of those who had tormented her, would return unbidden. She would sit up, breath shaking, her small hands clutching the blanket as if it could shield her from the ghosts that haunted her. The king, ever observant, noticed the subtle tremors in her body, the fleeting sadness that clouded her eyes. He did not push her to speak, for he knew that trust could not be rushed. Instead, he allowed her the space to process, the silence to reconcile her pain with the safety he now offered. He spent hours beside her, sometimes reading from books that transported her to distant lands, other times simply sitting, letting the quiet comfort speak louder than words ever could. Yet the past was not content to remain distant. One crisp morning, a messenger arrived at the gates of the manor, carrying news that sent ripples of fear through the carefully woven threads of Alara's new life. The man who had once owned her, the cruel master who had inflicted the deepest wounds, was stirring trouble. Rumors whispered of vendettas, of hunting down escaped slaves, of punishing those who dared to defy him. And now, it seemed, Alara's freedom and safety were no longer guaranteed. Alara trembled at the thought. The memory of his hands, rough and unrelenting, still haunted her. The very idea that he could find her here, in the sanctuary the king had created, made her chest tighten with panic. She wanted to hide, to flee, but she knew that running alone would not save her. The weight of her fear pressed down, suffocating, threatening to undo the fragile courage she had begun to feel. The king noticed her distress immediately. He did not demand answers but simply took her hand in his, the gesture gentle yet grounding. "You are safe," he said quietly, his voice firm, unwavering. "Here, I will protect you. No one will harm you while I stand by your side." Alara wanted to believe him, and deep down, she did. Yet the tremor of fear would not leave her, nor would the memories that clawed at her mind. She realized, with a mix of dread and determination, that her healing was not a straight path. There would be trials, shadows from her past that must be faced, and courage she did not yet know she possessed. The king, understanding the storm raging within her, began to prepare. He strengthened the manor's defenses, called upon loyal allies, and devised strategies to ensure that Alara could live without fear of intrusion. But more importantly, he sought to give her strength of spirit. He taught her how to stand firm, how to assert her presence even in the face of intimidation, how to channel fear into vigilance rather than paralysis. Slowly, she began to realize that protection was not only about walls and guards, it was also about understanding her own worth, and the power she held within. Days turned into weeks, and Alara found herself growing stronger, more confident, though the memories of her suffering never fully vanished. She learned to walk through the halls with her head held high, to meet the king's gaze without shrinking away, and to find small joys in the sanctuary around her. The scent of blooming flowers in the gardens, the warmth of the hearth on cold mornings, the sound of laughter, timid at first, escaping her lips. The king, too, found himself change. His heart, long encased in solitude, now beat with a rhythm attuned to hers. He noticed every small triumph, every spark of bravery, every flicker of emotion that passed across her face. And though he did not yet speak it aloud, he felt a deep, unshakable bond forming, one that was no longer just of protection, but of mutual respect, care, and the beginnings of love. Yet the shadows of the past were patient. The message from her former master was only the beginning. Alara knew, even as she smiled and laughed with the king, that danger lurked beyond the stone walls of the manor. And with that knowledge came a new resolve: she would not let fear dictate her life. She would stand by the king, and together, they would face whatever threats sought to undo the fragile peace they had built. That night, as the stars stretched across the velvet sky, Alara sat by the window, gazing at the distant horizon. She felt the weight of her past, yes, but also the pull of something bright. Hope, courage, and the promise of a life where pain did not rule, where love could bloom even in the aftermath of suffering. And as the wind whispered through the trees, she allowed herself to believe, for the first time in her life, that she was not alone, that she was valued, and that her story was far from over. The journey ahead would be fraught with trials, but for the first time, Alara understood that she had someone by her side who would face them with her. The king had shown her that the world could hold kindness, that the heart could heal, and that even in darkness, light could be found. And so, with trembling yet determined hands, she prepared herself for the battles to come, knowing that whatever lay ahead, she would not face it alone. The wind carried a bitter chill that morning, brushing through the trees surrounding the manor with a whisper of warning. Alara felt it in her bones, a silent tremor that hinted at the storm approaching, not the one that darkened the skies, but the one that threatened her fragile peace. She moved through the corridors with caution, her senses heightened, every creak of the floorboards sending a ripple of unease through her. Even though the king's presence provided a shield she had never known before, fear had a way of clinging stubbornly, refusing to be silenced. The day had begun with ordinary tasks, yet each moment seemed heavy, laden with a tension she could not shake. The servants whispered in hushed tones, exchanging glances that spoke of unease. Something was coming, something that even the vast walls and vigilant guards could not fully contain. Alara, having grown stronger yet still tender from her past, felt the tightening coil of dread in her chest. It was in the quiet of the late afternoon that the first sign appeared, a rider approaching the gates at a pace that spoke not of diplomacy but of urgency. The king, standing tall with an aura of calm authority, quickly assessed the situation. He did not raise his voice in alarm, nor did he let panic take root in the hearts of those who looked to him for guidance. Instead, he moved with precise, deliberate steps, summoning his closest advisors to prepare. Alara, he said softly, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder, do not fear. Whatever this is, we will face it together. You are not alone. Her heart raced at the sound of his voice. Each word seemed to anchor her, grounding the storm of fear swirling within her. She nodded, drawing in a deep breath, feeling a courage she had never known stirring within her chest. For the first time, she understood that strength was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to face it. The rider arrived, a messenger from the nearby village, carrying news that sent ripples through the sanctuary the king had buoy. Lieutenant. Reports spoke of her former master gathering forces, seeking to reclaim what he had lost, the Omega he had once owned, the defiance he could not accept. The threat was real, immediate, and dangerous. The king's eyes narrowed, the weight of responsibility settling on his broad shoulders. Every strategy, every precaution he had made would now be tested. Alara, though trembling slightly, met his gaze. I will not run, she whispered, the words as much a promise to herself as to him. I will not hide. I will face him. The king studied her, seeing the determination flickering behind the fear, and a small, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. Good, he said quietly. Because together, we are stronger than he can ever imagine. The following days were a whirlwind of preparation. Guards were doubled, patrols increased, and the manor became a fortress of vigilance. Alara trained under the king's guidance, learning not only to move with agility but to observe, to anticipate danger, to act with courage even when fear threatened to consume her. Each day brought new challenges, pushing her boundaries, and slowly transforming her from a frightened, submissive Omega into a young woman capable of standing tall in the face of threats. But danger has a way of testing more than physical strength. It probes the heart, the mind, the soul. One evening, as the sky bled crimson with the setting sun, Alara found herself alone in the gardens, the air heavy with the scent of roses and the promise of rain. The memories of her past surged, fierce and unyielding, the lash, the cruel laughter, the endless days of torment. She fell to her knees among the blooms, tears streaming down her cheeks, and whispered a prayer for courage she did not yet feel she possessed. It was then that the king found her. Without a word, he knelt beside her, gathering her trembling hands in his. His eyes, filled with unwavering conviction, held hers with a power that silenced the echoes of fear. Alara, he said softly, the past cannot touch you here. You are safe with me. And I will not let him take you back into that darkness. Not ever. The words, simple yet profound, washed over her like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. In that moment, she realized that strength was not something one could possess alone. It was found in trust, in connection, in knowing that someone would stand with you even when the world seemed determined to crush you. Night fell, and the manor's walls seemed to thrum with tension. The threat was close now, a shadow stretching toward them, and yet within the sanctuary, Alara and the king shared a quiet, unspoken promise. Whatever came, they would face it together. Her fear had not vanished, but it had transformed into vigilance, courage, and a quiet determination that no force could easily break. As they stood side by side on the balcony overlooking the valley, the wind tugging at their garments, Alara felt a strange sense of calm amidst the turmoil. She was no longer the fragile girl who had cowered under cruelty's hand. She was someone who could fight, who could stand, who could hope. And with the king at her side, she understood something she had never known before: she was not merely surviving. She was beginning to live. The storm was coming, but they would meet it together, and whatever the outcome, neither of them would. The wind carried a bitter chill that morning, brushing through the trees surrounding the manor with a whisper of warning. Alara felt it in her bones, a silent tremor that hinted at the storm approaching, not the one that darkened the skies, but the one that threatened her fragile peace. She moved through the corridors with caution, her senses heightened, every creak of the floorboards sending a ripple of unease through her. Even though the king's presence provided a shield she had never known before, fear had a way of clinging stubbornly, refusing to be silenced. The day had begun with ordinary tasks, yet each moment seemed heavy, laden with a tension she could not shake. The servants whispered in hushed tones, exchanging glances that spoke of unease. Something was coming, something that even the vast walls and vigilant guards could not fully contain. Alara, having grown stronger yet still tender from her past, felt the tightening coil of dread in her chest. It was in the quiet of the late afternoon that the first sign appeared, a rider approaching the gates at a pace that spoke not of diplomacy but of urgency. The king, standing tall with an aura of calm authority, quickly assessed the situation. He did not raise his voice in alarm, nor did he let panic take root in the hearts of those who looked to him for guidance. Instead, he moved with precise, deliberate steps, summoning his closest advisors to prepare. Alara, he said softly, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder, do not fear. Whatever this is, we will face it together. You are not alone. Her heart raced at the sound of his voice. Each word seemed to anchor her, grounding the storm of fear swirling within her. She nodded, drawing in a deep breath, feeling a courage she had never known stirring within her chest. For the first time, she understood that strength was not the absence of fear, but the willingness to face it. The rider arrived, a messenger from the nearby village, carrying news that sent ripples through the sanctuary the king had built. Reports spoke of her former master gathering forces, seeking to reclaim what he had lost, the Omega he had once owned, the defiance he could not accept. The threat was real, immediate, and dangerous. The king's eyes narrowed, the weight of responsibility settling on his broad shoulders. Every strategy, every precaution he had made would now be tested. Alara, though trembling slightly, met his gaze. I will not run, she whispered, the words as much a promise to herself as to him. I will not hide. I will face him. The king studied her, seeing the determination flickering behind the fear, and a small, almost imperceptible smile touched his lips. Good, he said quietly. Because together, we are stronger than he can ever imagine. The following days were a whirlwind of preparation. Guards were doubled, patrols increased, and the manor became a fortress of vigilance. Alara trained under the king's guidance, learning not only to move with agility but to observe, to anticipate danger, to act with courage even when fear threatened to consume her. Each day brought new challenges, pushing her boundaries, and slowly transforming her from a frightened, submissive Omega into a young woman capable of standing tall in the face of threats. But danger has a way of testing more than physical strength. It probes the heart, the mind, the soul. One evening, as the sky bled crimson with the setting sun, Alara found herself alone in the gardens, the air heavy with the scent of roses and the promise of rain. The memories of her past surged, fierce and unyielding, the lash, the cruel laughter, the endless days of torment. She fell to her knees among the blooms, tears streaming down her cheeks, and whispered a prayer for courage she did not yet feel she possessed. It was then that the king found her. Without a word, he knelt beside her, gathering her trembling hands in his. His eyes, filled with unwavering conviction, held hers with a power that silenced the echoes of fear. Alara, he said softly, the past cannot touch you here. You are safe with me. And I will not let him take you back into that darkness. Not ever. The words, simple yet profound, washed over her like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. In that moment, she realized that strength was not something one could possess alone. It was found in trust, in connection, in knowing that someone would stand with you even when the world seemed determined to crush you. Night fell, and the manor's walls seemed to thrum with tension. The threat was close now, a shadow stretching toward them, and yet within the sanctuary, Alara and the king shared a quiet, unspoken promise. Whatever came, they would face it together. Her fear had not vanished, but it had transformed into vigilance, courage, and a quiet determination that no force could easily break. As they stood side by side on the balcony overlooking the valley, the wind tugging at their garments, Alara felt a strange sense of calm amidst the two. R.M. Oil. She was no longer the fragile girl who had cowered under cruelty's hand. She was someone who could fight, who could stand, who could hope. And with the king at her side, she understood something she had never known before. She was not merely surviving. She was beginning to live. The storm was coming, but they would meet it together, and whatever the outcome, neither of them would. The morning air was thick with tension, the sunlight filtering weakly through the clouds, as if the world itself sensed the approaching danger. The manor, usually a haven of warmth and protection, now felt like the calm before a storm. Every shadow seemed to twitch, every rustle of leaves in the garden carried a whisper of menace. Alara's heart raced, her hands trembling slightly, but her resolve had hardened since the first news of her former master's approach. She would not flee. She would not cower. The king moved with precise command, his presence calm and authoritative even as the air grew heavy with anticipation. Guards took their positions at every gate, archers perched along the walls, and sentries patrolled the perimeter with hawk-like vigilance. Yet despite the preparation, there was an underlying tension, an unspoken acknowledgement that no fortress, however strong, could be impervious to cunning and malice. Alara stood at the center of the strategy room, her hands folded in front of her, her mind racing through every lesson the king had imparted. He had taught her to anticipate danger, to move with intention, to trust her instincts. Yet nothing could have prepared her for the first glimpse of the enemy, a small force riding across the distant hills, banners flapping violently in the wind, faces twisted with greed and cruelty. The king noticed her gaze and placed a firm, steady hand on her shoulder. "Do you see them?" he asked, not as a question, but as a call to readiness. "Fear is natural, Alara. But fear alone will not protect you. Remember what I've taught you. Stand tall. Breathe. Trust in yourself and in those who stand with you." She swallowed hard, drawing a deep breath that felt like fire in her lungs. The lessons he had taught, the trust he had nurtured, began to flow through her veins. She would not be helpless. She would not be a victim again. The first wave of riders struck just as the sun dipped behind the horizon, painting the sky in shades of blood and fire. Shouts echoed across the courtyard, swords clashed with steel, and the night erupted into chaos. Alara, guided by the king's steady commands, found herself moving with purpose. She relayed messages, assisted guards, and even helped tend to minor wounds, all under the shadow of impending danger. Her fear remained, but it was tempered by a newfound courage that surprised even her. In the thick of battle, the king's gaze often sought her. There was a protective fire in his eyes, a silent communication that said, "You are not alone." Their connection, built on trust and growing affection, became a lifeline in the storm of violence surrounding them. And yet, the enemy was relentless, driven by vengeance and the cruelty that had once ruled Alara's life. At one point, a rider broke through the outer defenses, rushing toward the king. Without hesitation, Alara's instincts took over. She threw herself in front of him, pulling him just out of reach as the rider's sword struck the stone floor with a deafening clang. The king's eyes widened, a mixture of shock and concern flashing across his face. "Alara," he exclaimed, but she only nodded, her pulse racing, adrenaline coursing through her veins. "I will not let him take me back. I will not be afraid." The battle raged through the night. The walls held, reinforced by the king's planning and the courage of those who stood with him. Every clash of steel, every cry of defiance, every surge of determination served to remind Alara of her own strength, the inner fire that no one could extinguish. She had survived cruelty before, but now she survived with purpose, with allies, with a man who saw her not as property but as a partner, a human being worthy of protection and respect. As dawn broke, the enemy, battered and disheartened, began to retreat. The king's forces had held the manor, and the threat had been repelled, for now. Alara, exhausted, bloodied from minor cuts but unbroken, sank to her knees in the courtyard, her chest heaving with relief and disbelief. The king knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her face, his hands steadying her trembling form. "You were remarkable," he said, his voice low and full of awe. "You faced your fear. You fought. You survived. And you did not do it alone. Never forget that, Alara." Tears of exhaustion and triumph streaked her cheeks. She had faced the shadows of her past, and though the scars remained, they no longer defined her. She had fought, she had stood, and she had discovered a strength she never knew existed. That night, as the manor quieted and the adrenaline of battle ebbed, the king and Alara sat together by the hearth. No words were necessary. The silence spoke of shared triumph, of connection forged in fire, and of a bond that could not be broken by fear or cruelty. In that quiet, amidst the flickering light, Alara realized something profound. She was no longer a slave of her past. She was alive, free in spirit, and, perhaps for the first time, truly seen and cherished. The storm had passed, but the journey was far from over. Yet for the first time, Alara felt the warmth of hope, the promise of life, and the possibility of love that could heal then the deepest wounds. And as she rested her head against the king's shoulder, she allowed herself to imagine a future where she was safe, where she belonged, and where the shadows of her past no longer held dominion over her heart. The first light of dawn spilled across the manor, bathing the courtyard in soft hues of gold and rose. The battle had ended, but the echoes of its violence lingered in the air. The scent of smoke and blood mingled with the earthy aroma of disturbed gardens, and the quiet murmur of the wounded reminded all who remained that the night's struggle had been real. Alara walked slowly among the guards and servants, offering what aid she could. Her hands were steady now, her movements purposeful, though her mind wrestled with the lingering tremors of fear. It was strange, she realized, how quickly life could shift from despair to cautious hope. Just days ago, she had been a trembling girl, hiding from a past that threatened to consume her. Now, she moved with confidence born from survival and determination. The battle had changed her, not just in skill and courage, but in spirit. She had discovered a strength she had never known, and in doing so, had begun to reclaim her own identity piece by piece. The king watched her from the steps of the manor, his eyes soft with a mix of pride and concern. She had faced the darkness without flinching, yet he sensed the weight of the experience pressing upon her still. Slowly, he descended to meet her in the courtyard, offering a quiet hand as she approached. "Are you well?" he asked, voice gentle yet steady, a contrast to the chaos that had surrounded them. Alara nodded, though the tremor in her hands betrayed her exhaustion. I am," she replied softly. "Stronger than I thought I could be. Thanks to you." He shook his head, his eyes full of quiet conviction. "No, Alara. This strength is yours. I only helped you see it. You faced your fear, and that is something no one could give you, it comes from within." For the first time, she allowed herself to feel the depth of his words, the truth that she had long denied. She was not merely surviving, she was living. Each scar, each trembling moment, each quiet triumph had forged her into someone new, someone capable of courage, of hope, of love. The days that followed were quieter, yet no less significant. The manor buzzed with activity, the guards tending to repairs, the servants restoring order, and the king overseeing every detail with careful precision. But amid the restoration, there was space for reflection, for healing, for moments of intimacy that went beyond mere survival. Alara found herself drawn to the king in ways she could not yet name. It was not merely gratitude, though she felt that deeply. It was not merely admiration, though she respected him fiercely. It was something more profound, a connection forged in shared trials, in the mutual recognition of vulnerability and strength. She found solace in his presence, comfort in his gaze, and a strange, burgeoning warmth in her chest whenever he was near. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and the sky turned a deep, bruised purple, the king invited her to walk in the gardens. The air was cool and fragrant with the scent of blooming flowers, the remnants of rain hanging delicately on petals and leaves. They moved slowly, side by side, neither speaking at first, both content to share the quiet. Finally, Alara spoke, her voice hesitant but earnest. "Do you ever regret trying to protect me?" The king shook his head, a small, thoughtful smile touching his lips. "Never. You are not someone to regret saving. You are remarkable, Alara. Strong, resilient, and capable of more than even you realize. And besides," he added softly, "I could not stand by while you suffered. I could not ignore your pain." Her heart ached at his words, a mixture of gratitude and something deeper she did not yet fully understand. I don't know how to thank you," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "You do not need to thank me," he said gently. "Your courage is thanks enough." In the days that followed, Alara began to reclaim the simple joys of life, walking through the gardens at dawn, tending to small tasks in the manor, even laughing quietly at moments of unexpected levity among the servants. She felt a sense of belonging she had never known, a rare freedom that came not from escaping her past, but from embracing the present and trusting in the safety she had found. The king, too, allowed himself to soften in ways he had not permitted for years. His interactions with Alara were no longer solely those of protector in charge. They were moments of shared understanding, of mutual respect, and a quiet affection that grew with every passing day. In her presence, he found peace he had thought lost forever, a reminder that life, even after tragedy, could hold beauty and connection. Yet even as healing began, the memory of danger lingered. Alara knew that threats could rise again, that the cruelty of the past was never far behind. But now, she faced that knowledge with a resilience and determination that was unwavering. She was no longer the helpless Omega who had once cowered in fear. She was a young woman who had faced shadows and emerged stronger, wiser, and more certain of her own worth. As the sun set one evening, casting the manor in a golden glow, Alara and the king stood together on the balcony, gazing over the valley below. The world was vast, filled with uncertainty and challenge, but in that moment, there was only peace. In each other. They had found solace, trust, and the first fragile tendrils of love. Alara rested her head against his shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart, and allowed herself to imagine a future where she was safe, cherished, and free. For the first time in her life, she did not just survive, she dreamed, she hoped, and she believed. And in the quiet warmth of the evening, with the battle behind them and the promise of tomorrow ahead, both of them understood something profound. Life could be beautiful, even after darkness. And together, they would face whatever came next, side by side, hearts intertwined, unbroken and unafraid. The days following the battle were quiet, yet quiet did not mean uneventful. The manor had returned to a state of calm, but in the stillness, new emotions stirred, delicate, fragile, and intoxicating. Alara felt them first in the early morning, as the sun spilled gentle light across her room, illuminating the dust motes that danced in the warmth. She lingered by the window, her thoughts caught between memory and desire, between caution and the strange thrill of possibility. She realized, with a mixture of surprise and fear, that her heart no longer belonged entirely to herself. It had begun to tether to the king, a man who had become not only her protector but the anchor of her new life. She recalled his steady presence during the siege, the way his hand had guided hers, the quiet confidence that never wavered even when the world around them descended into chaos. Those memories, once tinged with awe, now carried a warmth that sent shivers through her every time she thought of him. The king, too, sensed a shift. His eyes lingered longer than usual on her delicate movements, his hand brushed hers more deliberately, and the rare moments of silence they shared were no longer merely comfortable. They were charged with a subtle, electric tension. He had ruled kingdoms and commanded armies, yet he found himself navigating a realm far more intricate and unpredictable, the realm of the heart. And with every passing day, he realized that the bond he felt for Alara had grown into something deeper, something he could not ignore. One afternoon, as the autumn wind rustled the leaves in golden waves across the gardens, the king found her tending to a small patch of flowers. She was absorbed in her work, her brow furrowed in concentration, her hands gentle yet sure. He watched her for a long moment, marveling at the grace and resilience she carried, the way she moved through the world with both caution and courage. "Alara," he said softly, his voice drawing her out of her thoughts. She turned, slightly startled, yet her lips curved into a faint smile. "Yes, my king?" she asked, her tone polite yet tinged with curiosity. I wanted to see you, he simply, stepping closer. There was no ceremony in his words, no grand announcement, only honesty, raw and unguarded. You have faced so much, and yet you continue to rise. I admire you more than words can express. Her cheeks warmed at his gaze, the intensity of it stirring a nervous flutter in her chest. She had grown accustomed to respect and kindness, yet admiration carried a different weight, a recognition of value that went beyond mere survival. I only do what I must, she murmured, her hands unconsciously smoothing the petals of a nearby rose. I could not be like this, not without your guidance, your faith in me. The king knelt beside her, lowering himself to her level, his eyes locking with hers in a gaze that seemed to pierce through hesitation and fear. No, Alara, you do not need my guidance to be remarkable. You are remarkable because of who you are. I only helped you see it. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other, the world around them fading into insignificance. The wind carried the faint scent of flowers, the sunlight played across their faces, and the quiet hum of life in the manor seemed to hold its breath. And then, without warning, the barrier between caution and longing began to crumble. Alara felt the truth of her heart in a way that could not be denied. She was drawn to him, not out of fear, not out of obligation, but out of something deeper, more undeniable. And she saw in his eyes the same reflection of desire, respect, and tentative love that she had felt stirring in her own chest. Days turned into nights filled with quiet companionship. They shared moments that spoke louder than words, the king's hand brushing hers as they walked through the gardens, the small smile he gave when she laughed softly, the unspoken comfort of sitting together in silence before the fire. Trust and affection had grown into something delicate, intimate, and precious. Yet love, as both of them understood, did not flourish without courage. The world outside the manor still held dangers, whispers of cruelty, and reminders of the darkness Alara had survived. And so their growing bond was both a source of strength and a test, a reminder that to love was to risk, to trust, and to open oneself fully despite the possibility of pain. One evening, as they watched the stars emerge above the hills, Alara rested her head against the king's shoulder, allowing herself to feel the quiet certainty of belonging. I never thought I could feel this, she whispered. Safe, valued, loved. The king's hand tightened slightly around hers, his voice a low, tender murmur. And you deserve it all, Alara. Every bit of it. You deserve happiness, peace, and love. Not as a slave, not as someone bound by fear, but as you are. Truly, wholly, you. Tears glimmered in her eyes, a mixture of relief, gratitude, and the fragile, thrilling awareness of love taking root. She had endured so much, yet here she was, alive, cherished, and finally free to feel. The night stretched on, wrapped in quiet warmth. In each other, they had found not only safety but a promise of trust, of healing, and of a love forged in the fires of past trials. And in that serene, fragile moment, both understood something profound. Hearts, once broken, could awaken, could flourish, and could embrace joy once thought impossible. Alara's journey of fear and survival had brought her here, to courage, to trust, and now, at last, to the first true stirrings of love. And for the first time in her life, she allowed herself to imagine a future filled not with chains and cruelty, but with laughter, companionship, and the quiet magic of two souls bound together by understanding, respect, and the gentle, unyielding strength of the heart. The tranquility of the manor had become a rare treasure, one that Alara and the king cherished more with each passing day. But peace, as they had learned, was often fragile. The outside world, harsh, unpredictable, and unyielding, remained a reminder that their sanctuary was not impervious to intrusion. Even the smallest whispers of danger could unravel the delicate balance they had fought so hard to build. It began with rumors, subtle and insidious. Travelers passing through nearby villages spoke in hushed tones of a rising unrest, of men loyal to her former master gathering strength, emboldened by failure and humiliation. At first, the warnings were distant, almost inconsequential, but as days turned into weeks, the tension grew tangible. The king, ever vigilant, did not reveal the full extent of the threat to Alara, preferring to shield her from unnecessary fear. Yet she sensed it, a cold shadow that settled over the manor like an uninvited guest. Alara, now more confident and self-assured than ever before, refused to allow fear to dominate her. She moved with purpose through the halls and gardens, assisting the guards, tending to the wounded, and learning the subtle arts of strategy and observation under the king's guidance. Each day brought a new lesson, not just in defense, but in trust. She had learned to rely on her instincts, yet she also had to learn to rely on others, to share the burden of fear and responsibility rather than carry it alone. One afternoon, the king called her to the tower, where sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating the maps and scrolls that detailed the surrounding lands. His expression was serious, yet there was a softness reserved only for her. "Alara," he began, "I must speak honestly. There are forces gathering beyond these walls, forces that seek to undo all we Avenue built. I trust you to stand with me, to trust in yourself, and to trust in us. Can you do that?" Alara's heart quickened, not from fear, but from the weight of responsibility and the depth of connection implied in his words. She nodded, her voice steady despite the flutter of nerves. "I trust you," she said, meeting his gaze. "And I trust myself. We will face whatever comes, together." The king's hand brushed hers, a small, grounding gesture, and in that touch, Alara felt a surge of courage and resolve. Trust, she realized, was not merely a gift offered to another, it was a choice, a commitment to stand together even when uncertainty loomed. Days later, the trial arrived in the form of a messenger, this time bearing no threat, but a challenge. A noble from a neighboring kingdom, seeking to test the king's strength and alliances, requested a meeting under tense circumstances. Though the danger was not immediate, it was a subtle test, a reminder that the world beyond the manor did not yield easily. The king prepared meticulously and Alara observed, learning how diplomacy could be as treacherous as battle. They studied maps, considered contingencies, and rehearsed possible scenarios. Alara's mind, once clouded by fear, now grasped strategies with remarkable clarity. She understood that courage was not only physical, it was mental, emotional, and strategic. On the day of the meeting, the air was thick with anticipation. Alara and the king walked together through the halls, their steps synchronized, their presence a unified front. Outside the manor, the noble and his entourage awaited, eyes sharp and calculating, each movement a test of resolve. As they entered the meeting hall, Alara felt a moment of hesitation, a flicker of the old fear. But the king's hand on her back grounded her, his steady gaze reminding her of the bond they shared, of the trust they had cultivated. Together, they faced the challenge, not as master and omega, not as protector and protected, but as equals, partners in strength and resolve. The meeting was tense, filled with subtle power plays, carefully measured words, and unspoken challenges. Alara observed keenly, noting every nuance, every flicker of expression, every hidden intent. The king handled the negotiations with calm authority, yet she could see him glance at her from time to time, seeking her reassurance, her presence, and the quiet confidence that radiated from her now. By the end of the day, the noble departed, leaving behind a mixture of respect and wary acknowledgement. Alara and the king had navigated the challenge with grace and unity. And in that moment, she realized the depth of their growth, not only as individuals but as a team bound by trust, understanding, and mutual reliance. That night, as they sat together in the quiet of the manor, the tension of the day slowly dissolving, Alara rested her head against the king's shoulder. "I understand now," she murmured softly. "Trust is not just about safety, it's about believing in each other, even when the world tests us. Even when fear whispers in our ears." The king kissed her forehead gently, a gesture of both affection and reassurance. "Exactly, Alara. And you have learned it beautifully. You are no longer afraid to stand, to act, and to trust. And I am proud of you, not just for your courage, but for your heart, your wisdom, and the love you carry." Tears welled in her eyes, not of sorrow, but of relief and joy. She had faced the shadows, survived battles, and learned the intricate dance of trust and partnership. She had grown, not merely into an omega freed from chains, but into a woman who could stand tall, whose heart could love without hesitation, and whose spirit could shine even in the face of uncertainty. And as the moonlight bathed the gardens, illuminating the path they had walked together, Alara knew this truth with unwavering certainty. Whatever trials awaited them, they would face them side by side, hearts intertwined, courage unyielding, and love guiding every step of the journey. The manor had never felt more alive and yet more vulnerable at the same time. Autumn had deepened into early winter, and the cold wind sliced through the valley like a warning. Alara stood at the balcony, her breath forming delicate clouds in the crisp air, as she gazed toward the distant hills where shadows moved with purpose. She could feel it in her bones, the culmination of all the trials, the approaching storm that demanded courage, strategy, and unity. Her former master had returned. Not alone, not timidly, but with an army fueled by vengeance and cruelty, determined to reclaim what he believed he owned. But this time, Alara was no longer the frightened Omega cowering in chains. She had survived, grown, and learned to trust, not only in herself but in the man who had become her anchor, her shield, and, increasingly, the keeper of her heart. The king approached silently, his presence calm and commanding. He placed a firm, steady hand on her shoulder, grounding her in a moment where fear could have taken hold. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice carrying both authority and tenderness. Alara met his gaze, seeing the unwavering strength reflected there, and nodded. "I am," she said, her voice steady. "Not because I am without fear, but because I know we face this together." Together. The word held more weight than any shield or sword could. It was their bond, forged through fire, trust, and the quiet intimacy of shared trials. And it was what made her heart beat with courage rather than panic. The first wave of confrontation came at dawn. Riders crested the hills, banners snapping in the cold wind, and a horn blared a challenge across the valley. The manor stirred to life, guards taking positions, archers readying their bows, and the king moving with the precision of a commander who had seen countless battles. But it was Alara's presence at his side that defined the moment. She moved with purpose, relaying messages, aiding those in need, and occasionally stepping forward to direct the flow of defense. Her courage was no longer theoretical, it was tangible, recognized and respected by those who had once doubted her strength. The enemy's forces pressed forward, but the king's strategy, combined with Alara's sharp observation and quick thinking, held the line. Swords clashed, arrows flew, and the valley echoed with the roar of battle. In the chaos, the former master himself appeared, a figure of malice and obsession, his eyes locking onto Alara with a claim that had long been denied. "You belong to me," he shouted, advancing with reckless fury. Alara stood tall, her heart pounding but her voice steady. "I belong to no one but myself," she declared. "And I am not afraid of you." The king stepped forward, shielding her with his body yet allowing her to see that he trusted her to stand firm. In that moment, the unity between them became a force as powerful as any army, a shared courage, a bond that neither cruelty nor fear could break. The confrontation was brutal, testing both physical skill and the strength of their hearts. The king's presence was unwavering, but it was Alara's bravery, her refusal to cower, and her unshakable trust in him that turned the tide. The enemy faltered, disoriented by the unbreakable partnership before them, and one by one, their ranks fell back. At last, the former master faced defeat. Cornered, his fury turned to desperation, he lunged one final time, but the king intercepted, disarming him with precision. Alara, standing beside him, felt a surge of triumph. The shadows of her past had been confronted and defeated, not just by force, but by the courage she had cultivated, the wisdom she had gained, and the unyielding bond she shared with the king. As the dust settled and the valley grew quiet once more, the manor stood unbroken. Guards lowered their weapons, the servants emerged from hiding, and a sense of calm returned, heavier and more profound than ever before. Alara and the king stood together in the center of the courtyard, hands entwined, hearts still racing from the battle but steady in the knowledge that they had faced darkness, and prevailed. The king turned to her, his eyes soft but deep with emotion. "You were extraordinary," he said. "Brave, strong, and wise beyond measure. You have faced everything and come through unbroken." Alara felt tears prick at her eyes, a mixture of relief, joy, and the profound realization that her life had truly changed. "I could not have done it without you," she whispered. I trust you completely. And I love you." The king's hand cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing away the traces of tears. "And I love you, Alara." From this day forward, nothing will separate us. You are mine, not by chains or fear, but by choice, heart, and soul. Together, we are stronger than any darkness. As the sun broke over the horizon, casting golden light across the valley, they embraced, two hearts, two souls, unbroken and united. The trials of the past had shaped them, but they no longer defined them. Together, they had conquered fear, cruelty, and shadows. Together, they would face the future, not as protector and omega, but as partners, equals, and lovers bound by trust, courage, and unwavering love. And in that moment, the world seemed to breathe with them, offering the promise of peace. The manor lay in a serene silence that felt almost sacred, the chaos of past battles reduced to echoes in the memory of its stone walls. Autumn had given way to winter, and the first snow dusted the gardens with a delicate, sparkling layer, as if the world itself celebrated the peace that had been won. Alara stood at the edge of the balcony, the cold air brushing her face, yet she felt warmth radiating from deep within her chest, a warmth born not of fire, but of triumph, trust, and love. The events of the past months had transformed her life completely. She had survived cruelty and captivity, learned to stand against fear, discovered her own strength, and cultivated a love that was honest, mutual, and unshakable. She no longer lived under the shadow of her past. Instead, she stood in the bright light of possibility, her heart open, her spirit unbound. The king joined her, his presence as steady and reassuring as the mountains in the distance. He wrapped a cloak around her shoulders, the warmth a small but significant gesture, and rested a hand over hers. "Do you see it?" he asked softly. "The world feels different now, doesn't it?" Alara nodded, letting her eyes sweep across the valley below, where life continued in quiet harmony. "Yes," she whispered. "It feels alive, safe, full of hope." The king's gaze softened, and he leaned slightly closer. "All of this, Alara, is ours to protect, to nurture, and to enjoy. No one can take this from us, not our peace, not our love, not the life we've built together." She smiled, a slow, radiant smile that had nothing to do with caution or fear and everything to do with joy. "I never thought I could feel this whole," she admitted, her voice trembling with emotion. "Not after everything I've been through. But now, I do. Because of you, because us." He gently tilted her chin to meet his eyes, and in that gaze, Alara saw the reflection of her own strength and courage, magnified and cherished. "You are whole, Alara," he said firmly. "Not because of me, not because of anyone else, but because you survived, you grew, and you chose to embrace life. I only have the honor of walking beside you." The manor's halls echoed with laughter and life that evening. Servants moved with ease, tending fires, preparing meals, and sharing in the quiet relief of normalcy restored. Guards patrolled with the confidence of those who knew the walls they defended were more than stone, they were symbols of a life reclaimed. And through it all, Alara and the king moved together, intertwined not only in purpose but in heart. As night fell, they found themselves in the garden, where the snow shimmered under the moonlight, the world hushed and still. The king drew her close, their breaths mingling in the cold air, and for the first time, they allowed themselves the fullness of intimacy, not just of touch, but of soul. "Alara," he murmured, his lips brushing her temple, "we've faced shadows together, endured trials, and conquered fears. But the greatest victory is this. Being here, together, free to love, to live, and to dream." Her hands rested on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart, and she let herself smile, truly smile, without hesitation or fear. "Yes," she agreed, her voice soft yet certain. "And I want nothing more than to spend every day building this life with you, protecting it, and sharing it. Not as a slave, not as someone broken, but as me. Whole, loved, free." The king's arms tightened around her, and for a moment, the world beyond the manor ceased to exist. There were no battles, no shadows, no echoes of cruelty, only the warmth of connection, the promise of tomorrow, and the quiet strength of two hearts bound together. Winter's first snow continued to fall, covering the garden in a blanket of white, a symbol of purity, renewal, and new beginnings. Alara and the king stood together, hands entwined, hearts beating in perfect rhythm. The trials of the past had forged a love that was unbreakable, a partnership built on trust, courage, and mutual respect. And as the first stars of the night glimmered overhead, Alara whispered a quiet vow, not only to the king, but to herself. I will live, I will love, and I will never let fear define me again. The king, hearing her unspoken promise, whispered in return, and I will stand beside you, always. For every tomorrow, for every dream, and for every moment of this life we now share. In that embrace, amidst the snow, the stars, and the quiet serenity of the manor, they found the ultimate truth. Happiness was not merely survival, nor was love simply desire, it was the choice to stand together, to trust, and to cherish every moment of a life reclaimed. And so, in the stillness of the night, with the world at peace and their hearts intertwined, Alara and the king stepped into the future, unafraid, unbroken, and bound by a love that had triumphed over every shadow. The story of the slave Omega and the widowed king had reached its happy ending, not through magic or luck, but through courage, trust, and the unyielding strength of the human heart. Together, they would face whatever came next, and this time, they would do so as equals, partners, and lovers, free at last. The first light of morning spilled over the hills, casting golden warmth across the manor and its gardens. The frost of winter sparkled on the branches, like tiny crystals celebrating the peace that had finally settled over their lives. After months of fear, battles, and uncertainty, the world felt alive again, safe, quiet, and full of promise. Alara stood at the edge of the balcony, her breath forming little clouds in the crisp air, but her heart burned with warmth. The fear that had once gripped her so tightly, the memory of chains, cruelty, and endless oppression, had melted away. She had survived, she had fought, and she had learned to trust herself and the man who had become her anchor, her partner, and her love. The king appeared beside her, his presence steady and comforting. Without a word, he draped a warm cloak around her shoulders, the gesture small but significant, a shield against the cold, and a reminder of the countless times he had shielded her from harm. He took her hand gently in his, their fingers intertwining naturally, and she felt a thrill of certainty. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. You see it, don't you? He asked softly. The valley, the manor, all of it feels different now. Alara nodded, her eyes sweeping over the snow-kissed gardens and the quiet life returning to the village beyond the walls. Yes, she whispered. It feels alive, peaceful, like hope itself. The king turned to her, his eyes soft and unwavering. All of this is ours to protect, to nurture, and to cherish. Not by fear, not by chains, but by choice, by love, and by courage. Alara's chest swelled as she met his gaze, her lips curving into a slow, radiant smile. I never thought I could feel this, whole, free, loved. But now I do, because of you, because of us. He cupped her face in his hands, the tenderness in his touch echoing the strength in his voice. You are whole, Alara. Not because of me, not because of anyone, but because of yourself. Because you survived, because you fought, because you chose to live. I only have the honor of standing by your side. For the first time in her life, Alara truly understood the depth of freedom. Not just freedom from chains, but freedom to love, to hope, to trust, and to dream. She was no longer defined by her past or by cruelty. She was alive, her heart open, her spirit unbound, and her life entirely her own. That evening, the manor was alive with celebration. The servants moved with joyful purpose, the guards shared quiet laughter, and the halls echoed with warmth that had been absent for far too long. Alara and the king walked together through the gardens, their hands clasped, sharing silent smiles and small touches that spoke louder than words. The snow crunched beneath their feet, a soft, reassuring rhythm, as if the world itself was celebrating their peace. Finally, they stopped beneath a large, ancient oak, its branches heavy with snow. The king looked into Alara's eyes, his expression tender, serious, and full of unspoken emotion. Alara, he said, his voice breaking the serene silence, we've faced darkness, cruelty, and fear together. But the greatest victory is this. Being here, with you, free to love and to live. Alara's hands rested over his heart, feeling its steady, unyielding beat. And I want nothing more than to spend every day building this life with you, protecting it, and sharing it. Not as someone broken, but as me. Whole, loved, free. A gentle wind swirled around them, carrying the scent of winter blooms and the soft promise of tomorrow. The king's arms enveloped her, and at last, they embraced fully, letting go of the past, the fear, and the pain. There were no chains, no threats, no shadows, only the warmth of connection, the light of love, and the unshakable knowledge that they were stronger together. Snow continued to fall around them, a shimmering blanket of purity and renewal. Alara and the king stood entwined beneath the oak, hearts beating in perfect rhythm. The battles, the hardships, and the trials of the past had forged a love that could not be broken, a bond that would endure through all time. And as the stars emerged, twinkling above the valley like tiny promises of hope, Alara whispered a quiet vow, not just to the king, but to herself. I will live, I will love, and I will never let fear define me again. The king, hearing her heart in those words, whispered back, and I will always stand beside you, for every tomorrow, for every dream, and for every moment of this life we now share. In that moment, the world seemed to breathe with them. Every trial, every shadow, every tear and triumph had led them here, to freedom, to love, to a life reclaimed. And together, they stepped forward into the future, unafraid, unbroken, and forever united. The story of the slave Omega and the widowed king had reached its true ending, not through magic or fate, but through courage, trust, and the enduring strength of the human heart. And now, at last, they could finally live the life they had always deserved, happy, free, and together.